The following account took place in 1964, where Robert Cowan, an artist who worked for an advertising agency in New York City, and his actress wife Dorothy lived in their house called 1780 House in Stamford, Connecticut. The house was built during the American Revolution and stands on a wooden slope, which is responsible for its original name of Woodpecker Ridge Farm. The couple had been living in the house for 9.5 years, and about once a week during the time they'd lived there, Robert had noticed unidentifiable movements out of the corner of his eye, day or night. He saw it most often while sitting in the parlour, and what he saw moving seemed to be in the living room. At other times, and only late at night when he was the only one awake, would hear beautiful but unidentified music, seemingly played by a full orchestra. It was as if a radio were on in another part of the house. However, the only place he heard it was in the upstairs bedroom, and just after he had gone to bed. On one occasion, he got up and opened the bedroom door to see whether it was music from a radio that had been left on, but it wasn't the case. He would often hear a variety of knocks and crashes that had no logical source within the structural setup of the house. On another occasion, he heard a very loud smash coming from upstairs, which sounded as if a door had fallen off its hinges, but on inspection found there was nothing out of order. Dorothy had two very vivid experiences, where one was outside the kitchen window. It was in the evening while she was standing at the sink. As she glanced out the window, she saw a face glaring in at her. It looked Native American and appeared hateful and fierce. Initially, she thought it was a distorted reflection in the glass, but on closer inspection could see it was a face glaring directly at her and seemed translucent. It didn't disappear, but she certainly did. One summer afternoon, Dorothy was napping in the back bedroom and half awake. She heard the sound of men's voices, and they appeared to be working on the grounds with rakes and other garden tools outside the bedroom window. She tried to rouse herself to see who they were, but she found she couldn't get up. Up to that time, they only had hired a single man to come in and work in the garden. About a year later, they hired a crew that came in and worked once a week on the garden. Did Dorothy experience a type of precognition? Dorothy had always had an uneasy feeling about the outside of the back of the house, and still occasionally hears men's voices outside, but after looking out of the window, could not see anyone. She also shared her husband's experience of seeing things out of the corner of her eye, and also hearing enchanting music at night. Up till then, she hadn't paid much attention to the noises around the house, because it told her that all old houses had strange structural noises. Robert intended to sell the house, not because of ghosts, but because they wanted to move to the city again. On February the 9th, 1964, Robert heard a singing voice quite clearly downstairs and music again. One evening, he and his wife had invited the famous ghost hunter Hans Alzar and his wife Catherine for dinner to discuss the various hauntings, where Alzar hoped to hear the music. After a period of time, they could indeed distinguish faraway indistinct musical sounds, as if someone were playing a radio at a great distance. After checking, they found no source as to where it was coming from, either from a nearby house or a parked car whose radio could be responsible for it. After a while, they got up and looked about the room, and as they were quietly admiring the furniture, both Alzar and his wife, as well as the Cowans, clearly heard footsteps overhead. They were firm and strong, and could not be mistaken for anything else, such as a squirrel in the attic, nor was it an old house settling. Alzar went immediately up the stairs and into the room above their heads, where they heard the steps. As you turned the switch, there was no one there, and there was nobody else in the house at the time. They then went to inspect the smaller room next to the one in which they had heard the footsteps. The small room was where Dorothy had experienced an unusual phenomenon, where a bright light suddenly came and went. He carefully looked over the room, where the windows were arranged in such a way that a reflection from passing cars was out of the question. Both windows were far apart and on different walls, and opened into the dark countryside away from the only road. They all sat down and waited quietly for about 20 minutes in the dark. As he gazed towards the back wall of the little room, he saw a blinding flash of white light in the corner, facing him. It came on and disappeared very quickly, so quickly, in fact, that his wife had missed it. But Dorothy saw it and exclaimed, "There it is again, exactly as I saw it." Alzar went back to New York soon after, but later received an urgent call from Robert stating that there'd been some additional activity where he and his wife heard knocking about the house. On the evening of Thursday, February the 27th, he was driving home alone from the station as Dorothy was in New York. As he approached the house, he noticed that there was a light on in the main floor bedroom and also a light on up in the sewing room on the top floor, a room where Dorothy also uses for rehearsal. He thought she'd left the lights on. He drove past the house and down to the garage, put the car away and walked back to the house and noticed that the light on the top floor was now off. He entered the house and noticed that the dogs were calm. He went upstairs and found that the light in the bedroom was also off. He checked the entire house and there was absolutely no sign that anyone had been there. On Saturday the 29th of February, Robert was taking a nap in his studio and was awakened by the sound of footsteps in the room above him. It was the same room they all sat in on the previous Sunday. On Sunday, March the 15th, Alzar again arrived at the house along with medium Ethel Myers. They sat in the large living room where the music had been heard, and when they had been standing at the time they heard the footsteps overhead. Ethel suddenly said, "I sense a woman in a white dress. She's got dark hair and a high forehead." Rather a small woman. Robert said, "I was looking through the attic earlier and found a waistcoat that would fit a rather smallish woman or girl. The piece of clothing seemed rather musty, and there were a number of articles in the attic that must have belonged to an earlier owner of the house." Then Ethel Myers showed the characteristic signs of onsetting trance, and they quickly doused the lights until only one backlight was on. At first, inarticulate sounds came from the medium's lips. "You can speak," he said to encourage her. "You're among friends." The sounds now turned into crying. "What is your name?" he asked, as he always did on such occasions. There was laughter, and suddenly Ethel started to sing in a high-pitched voice. Alzar then assured the entity that she could speak. "Happy to speak with you," she mumbled faintly. "What is your name?" And she said, "Lucy." "Tell me, Lucy, do you live in this house?" "My house." "What year is it?" The entity hesitated a moment, then turned towards Dorothy and said, "I like you." He said, "How old are you?" "Old lady." The conversation had been friendly, but when Alzar asked what her husband's name was, the entity drew back, as if he had spoken a horrible word. "What did you say?" she almost shouted. "I have no husband." Alzar said, "You did have a husband then." "Yes, I did." "Where is he? And who is he?" "They took him out and laid him cold in the ground." "What year was that?" "Year? Year?" she repeated. "Now, now." Alzar asked, "Who rules the country now?" "Why, he who seized it." "Who rules?" "The saviour of our country, General Washington." Alzar said, "How did you come to this house?" "I am born here." "Was it your father's house?" "Yes." A short time later, Ethel Myers was back to her old self, and as usual, did not remember anything of what she had said. Alzar later called Robert and asked how things were in Stamford. "Quiet?" "Not very. Last June, Dorothy and I were at home with a friend who happened to be a psychic. They were playing around with a Ouija board, more as an amusement rather than seriously. Suddenly, the Sunday afternoon quiet was disrupted by heavy footsteps coming up the steps outside the house. They quickly hid the Ouija board, and they did not want a potential buyer of the house to see them in this unusual pursuit. They were sure someone was coming up to see the house, but the steps abruptly stopped when they reached the front door. When Robert opened the door, there was no one outside. Alzar asked whether there was anything else. Yes, in July they had a house guest, and there was a sudden crash upstairs, and when he rushed up the stairs to the sewing room, there was this bolt of material that had been standing in a corner, lying in the middle of the room, as if thrown there by unseen hands. Margaret, the house guest, also heard someone humming a tune in the bathroom, although there was no one in there at the time. Then in November, when just the two of them were in the house, someone knocked at the door downstairs. They looked, but there was nobody outside. One evening when he was in the ship room and Dorothy was in the bedroom, they heard footsteps coming down the staircase. Since neither of them had caused the footsteps and the door was closed, only a ghost could have been walking down those stairs. But the most frightening experience of all, Dorothy said, was when she was sleeping downstairs and woke up needing to go to the bathroom. She did not turn on the lights so as not to wake her husband. Groping her way back to bed, she suddenly found herself up on the next floor in the blue room, which is fairly difficult when walking in the dark. She had the feeling someone was forcing her to follow them into that particular room. On December the 15th, Alzar took Ethel Myers to the house for another go at the restless spirits that resided there. They were all seated in the ship room on the first floor, and Ethel started to drift into trance. "There's a baby's coffin here," she murmured, "like a newborn infant's. Your grandfather clock at the back of them was ticking loudly. I heard someone call Maggie," said Ethel. "Do you see anyone?" "A woman, about 5 feet tall, in a long dress, with a big bustle in the back. Hair down, parted in the middle and braided on both sides. There is another young woman, Lori, very pretty face, but so sad. What is your family name?" "Lori Oh, if I could only get that name." But she couldn't. Neither could she give him the name of her beloved, killed by her grandfather. It was a name she was not allowed to mention around the house, so she had difficulty remembering now, she explained. "What is your mother's name?" Alzar asked. "Margaret." "What year were you born?" 1756. "What year is it now?" 1774. "We laid him to rest in 1774. "In the church?" "No, grandfather could not bear it. We laid him to rest on the hill to the north." Alzar explained to her that the house would soon change hands and that she must not interfere. The Cowans had the feeling that the ghost was somehow keeping all buyers away. She promised not to interfere and to accept a new owner of their house. They went to the upstairs sewing room where the latest manifestations had taken place and grouped themselves around the heavy wooden table. Ethel almost immediately fell into a trance again. She rarely does twice in one sitting. The voice reverberating in the near darkness now was clearly that of a man, and a very dominating voice. "Who are you?" demanded Alzar. "Sergeant Major." Alzar asked, why was he here in this house? "One has pleasant memories." "Your name?" "Sergeant Major Harm." First name? Instead of giving it, he explained that he once owned the house and was friend, not foe. Alzar looked at Robert, who knew all the owners of the property in the old records, and said, "I don't know of a Harm." "How did you pass over?" Alzar inquired. "On the field of battle, on the banks of the Potomac, 1776. "What regiment were you in?" Alzar asked. "York, 8. I was a foot soldier, 18th Regiment." "What army?" "Wayne." "Who is your commanding general?" "Broderick." "Who is the colonel of your regiment?" "Wayne." "You were a sergeant major." "Sergeant major, 18th Regiment, Foot Infantry." "Where were you stationed?" "New York." "Where in New York?" "Champlain." "Your regimental commander again?" "Broderick." Then he added emotionally, "I died under fire. First Battle of Potomac." "Where are you buried?" "Fort Ticonderoga, New York." Alzar wondered how a soldier fighting on the banks of the Potomac could be buried in upstate New York, but he thought that the word Potomac had come so softly that he could have been mistaken. "The date of your death?" 1776. Then the voice became more and more indistinct. "I will leave now," and trailed off into silence. A few moments later, Ethel emerged from the trance. They returned to New York soon after, hoping that all would remain quiet in the Cowan house and that there would soon be a new lord of the manor at the 1780 house. Alzar checked the regimental records. No soldier named Harm, but a number of officers named Harmon. Alzar rechecked his tapes. The name Harm had been given by the ghost very quietly. He could have said Harmon. Alzar then discovered something very interesting in the Connecticut state papers. There is a mention of a certain Benjamin Harmon, junior lieutenant, who was with a local regiment in 1776. But could another building have occupied the area? Was the 1780 house an adaptation of a smaller dwelling, of which there is no written record? that a General Mad Anthony Wayne was in charge of the revolutionary troops in the New York area at the time the young entity claimed to have served.